Thank you. I think this was a good segment to go into my stuff. I'm going to talk about some of the same things, and so you've been sort of prepared about it. I guess right off the bat, I do want to say that in my hands and in my experience, I use a lot of modified lives, and I'm a big modified live fan. But also, I really stress that we start those calves at Brandon. That's when we start with the modified live program. And the reason I think that's so important is that calf's immune system, as cow-calf producers, you have a window into a calf's immune system that nobody else has. And so taking advantage of that early at branding can make a real difference. And I'm going to show you some of that. So I use the heck out of modified lives till I get them into the cow herd. And then I agree. I think that I'll show you some work that we're doing that kind of backs up with what Dr. Perry said about using the hybrid vaccine in your cows. So why did we start with this? You need to understand, I'm not a research guy. I was a veterinary practitioner, and I was out in the country, and I always had these questions. And so now my position with the university, I've had the opportunity to things called grad students that allow you to answer some of these questions. And I had a great grad student that helped me with this research. And it started because we noticed that in my part of the country, and we were having kind of a loss of pregnancy in cows, noticed by maybe a few more dries at Brandon time, but especially dry cows coming in the fall. These are cows that we turned out bred, and they were not bringing a calf in. And so that was concerning to us. In New Mexico, we have a surveillance program, and it was reported by several of the veterinarians that are involved in that. They were also noticing an increase in dry cows at preg check. So that got us alerted, so we started doing a bunch of blood work. And what we found on that blood work is that kind of across the board, we were able to find the presence of BVD virus and the presence of high leptotiters, which made it suggestive that we were seeing an increase in lepto exposure and in exposure to BVD virus. And so what that told us is that, or me as a veterinarian, was I need to step up my game when it comes to BVD prevention, because our herds, we had a lot more exposure than what we thought was going on. So what we ended up doing is we did some titer work, and I don't know how much you know about titers. Titers are an aid. They're a tool in the toolbox. They're not indicative. You can have high titers that aren't protective, but it's something to tell us, did this animal respond, or does it have a titer that shows either exposure or response to a vaccine. So titers are important. One of the things that I got to wondering about, though, is I always wondered, if we keep vaccinating these cows every year, do we need to keep doing it? Is that something that's important? And you don't ever see vaccine trials that go for a long period of time, because that's expensive. So luckily, out at the Corona Ranch, we had the opportunity to start this project, and I'll show you what the deal is. So I have a couple of thoughts here. I believe that BVD is the most common cause of pregnancy loss in the herds that I work with. That's the bottom line. I think BVD is a big deal. And so in my opinion, I think that you better have BVD prevention strategies, period. Every ranch should have this. Not necessarily because of the presence of PIs, but because of exposure that takes place that we don't know about. I think every ranch has the opportunity to. This is a gift that keeps giving. I'm just saying, BVD is a bad deal, and you don't want it. So you need to do everything you can to don't bring it home. So PI test. I think PI testing is extremely important. You should PI test every animal that comes onto your place. Bulls, when you buy bulls, PI test them if they're not already done. If you buy replacement heifers, PI test them before you ever bring them. I think it's that important. And so talk to your veterinarian about developing your biosecurity plan against BVD, because I think it's a big deal. So what we did in this project is I used Bovishield 5 Gold, and I also used Cattle Master, because those are vaccines that I had great familiarity with. I started using Bovishield in the late 80s, and I was using it on calves at Brandon because we were having some wrecks, and long before it was ever labeled to use in a suckling calf, I was using that particular vaccine. And it was based on some work that was done out of Kansas State about, does this product shed? And looking at the safety of using Bovishield, to me, it was enough to make that decision that BovaShield was the modified live that I was going to use. I am not saying that other modified lives are bad. I'm just telling you that I use these two vaccines to compare, to give us some idea. So that's important to understand. And what we were looking at is we did a couple of different things, and we were just looking at the differences between the two vaccine schedules. I'm not going to touch much on this for the interest of time. Most everybody's familiar with BVD. The biggest thing you need to know about BVD is that PIs can happen. So if a pregnant cow gets exposed to the virus and the virus crosses the placenta between day 25 or day 40 and day 125, that calf has the potential to become persistently infected or infected for life. And if it does, when it's born, it starts shedding the virus from the day it's born, and it sheds the virus every day of its life at about 10,000 times the rate of a natural infection. So these typhoid Marys that these PIs are way worse than any other kind of exposure. So BVD PIs are a big deal. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to look at. So my hypothesis was cattle receiving a modified live vaccination against BVD, I was strictly focused on BVD, would have increased titers over their lifetime compared to those receiving a hybrid vaccine. That's to be expected. I would expect a modified live to give better protection. So what we did is we ran titers, and like I said, I used BovaShield 5 Gold FP as my modified live vaccine, and Cattle Master 5 Gold, which remember, Cattle Master is a chemically altered IBR PI3. So when it warms to body temperature, it quits replicating. So it's safe to use at any stage of pregnancy because once it goes into the body and warms up, it no longer replicates. So it's not the IBR and the PI3 fractions are not killed. They're just altered. The BVD fraction is killed. It's a straight kill. And then the BRSV portion of it is a modified live. So that's important to understand. So when we talk about hybrid, and in my slides you'll see a lot of reference to KV or killed virus, that's because I'm talking specifically about the BVD fraction. And it is a killed product, okay? So this is how I started on this, and I got this idea. So in 2014, when we picked the replacement heifers at the Corona Range and Livestock Research Center in Corona, New Mexico, when we split our heifers, all of the calves at Brandon got them a modified live. They got BovaShield. And then after that, I split them. For the rest of their life, they've either received Cattle Master or they have received BovaShield. And that's the only vaccine they've seen the rest of their life. What cows we have left, that's still the only vaccine they've ever seen. Once they were broken into a group, that's the group they stayed in. So I have this group that they received modified live their whole life. They've never seen anything different. This, in 2014, this calf got a modified live, but then after that, it's on Cattle Master the rest of its life. And that's the only vaccine it's seen. So then I also, in 2015, we did the same thing, but I split them before branding. So my Cattle Master cows have never seen a modified live. Or they've seen only BovaShield, depending on what group they fill in. That's important to understand. Okay, so what did I do? I bled the heck out of these calves. Every time I do something, I bleed them. So I bled them 30 days before I vaccinated, or when I vaccinated, and anytime I gave them a vaccination, I would bleed them, vaccinate them, and then bleed them 30 days later and look at their titers. And that was true for every vaccine that we used. Every time they got a vaccine, that's what they got. Now, once they became a bred cow and they stayed in the herd, they get sampled 2 times a year. We sample them when we brand, which is 6 months post-vaccine, and I sample them at preg check, which is 12 months post-vaccine, and then they get their annual booster. And my idea was I wanted to see what happens out there, because I felt like I got an idea that these range cows in New Mexico probably have a better immune system than the calves that they test in these vaccine trials. So I wanted to know, is that true? And then the other thing, Emily, my grad student, when she was doing this is part of her PhD work, she also looked at some reproductive parameters. So if you see that star that's there, that AFC, that's the antral follicle count. Now this pre-breeding booster, we did booster them, depending on what strategy they were on, 60 days before the breeding season. So with what Dr. Perry told you, I think it's important to understand that you should never vaccinate around the breeding time. It's doesn't matter what vaccine you use, don't do it, because you do affect reproduction there. I think 60 days prior to breeding is probably pretty good. Minimum for me is 35 days. I think for sure you don't want to be inside 35 days for boostering. But I think that what we've seen in this project, because of those calves that got the modified lives, I think by doing it at branding, we've eliminated seeing a lot of the problems that Dr. Perry saw in his research, or at least that would be my theory. So anyway, we did all kinds of stuff to them. So like I said, this is how we vaccinate them. So here's the IBR titers. Remember, the IBR fraction is chemically altered. So when we compare our modified live, and that's the hybrid vaccine up here. These are slides that Emily had, and I couldn't figure out how to change that. So it's a mechanical thing as to why it says killed. But on the IBR, it's actually the chemically altered portion. There's not a lot of statistical difference between these two. There is differences as you see up and down. These are the confidence level that 95% of the values fell within 95%. I'm not a statistician, and I get over my skis really quickly when it comes to statistics. So don't ask me any statistical questions, because I can't answer. I just know that what I know is that this right here, if it's little, it's good. That's all I know. The smaller the number, the better it is. Anyway, so what we saw, that the titers were really similar. We didn't see a lot of difference. Not surprising, because it is the chemically altered vaccine behaves like a modified live, so I wouldn't expect a lot of difference. And that's what we saw. When we look at the BVDs, we start to see some differences. There in 2014 cattle that had the modified live at branding, that's the only time they got it. And then the killed ones, there's not a lot of difference there. They're pretty similar, which is okay, because this group of calves, they got that modified live at Brandon, so they're behaving like it. Our 2015 cattle are a little different, because some of those did not receive a modified live. The killed ones didn't. This is what we saw. The IBR titers were increased in cattle receiving the hybrid vaccine. That's for IBR. So if they only got the hybrid vaccine, it was a little different. The IBR titers were a little higher in those receiving the cattle master. Had difficulty explaining that. I'm not really sure why that is, but part of it has to do with the adjuvant system that is used in this particular brand of vaccine. May be present in others, I don't know, but this is what I think the difference is. When I look at the BVD titers, the titers on the cows that got the hybrid for strains, for BVD 1A and 1B, they're a little higher. They are different, statistically different. And BVD 2, they were pretty much the same. That's the 2015 born cattle. So what did it do with our heifers? Antral follicle counts, they were pretty much the same. Unit horn diameters, reproductive scores. Basically, we didn't see really any reproductive parameter differences between the two vaccines. But I think a lot of that may be because we started preparing those cattle early. And we probably are far enough down the road that we have got over all those speed bumps associated with it, which I think underlines why you shouldn't be breeding or shouldn't be vaccinated when you're synchronizing. So, reproduction, there really wasn't anything different. In our pregnancy rates, first service conception, not a lot of difference if you look there. We had some numerical differences, but statistically they weren't great. And so in our hands, there really wasn't much of a difference between the modified live vaccine and the cattle master on reproduction. What about herd retention? Do we cull modified live cows or kill faster? And the answer was no, there was no difference. They stayed in the herd. Those that have only received modified lives or those that have only received the cattle master, they stayed in the herd about the same time. The attrition rates, no different. Here's some differences that we begin to see that I think are important. So when we talk about the immune system and its response, there's two different types of responses. We have the humoral response, which we see with antibodies and normal things that you think about, like if you have allergies, you understand this, the antibody response, because if you get the antigen in you, your eyes water and your nose runs and all that, that's an antigen-antibody response. That's a humoral side of things. But we also have a cell-mediated side of things, and that's what this is trying to look at, some cell-mediated immune responses. Cell-mediated immunity is probably the most important fraction we have when it comes to viral protection, because a lot of the modified lives won't drive titers up real high, but see, viruses don't spend a lot of time where antibodies can get to them. They're intracellular, right? They're inside tissue. So circulating antibodies will pick up virus that happens to be circulating, but most of our viruses reside in tissue. So how that cell deals with the viral particles inside the cell is what really matters. So when we looked at these pre-vaccination, you can see there's not a lot of difference there, even statistically. There's 3 different types. We've got CD4, CD8. These are types of immune cells. The one that I think is the most important is the NK cell, because that's what's called the natural killer cell. And in the viral response, that natural killer cell is your big gun. It's the one that does a majority of the work. So we like to see lots of natural killer cells. So when we looked at that pre-vaccination, not a heck of a lot of difference. You see there's some, with our modified lives, we've got some higher CD4s than we have. When we look at it post-vaccination, this is BVD1. In our hybrid vaccine, look how high the natural killer cell went up. To me, that was a big deal. So what that was telling me, in terms that I could understand, that if I've prepared them, I think preparing them with a modified live and then going into a cattle master regimen is a really good thing. And I say cattle master because it's the hybrid vaccine. There may be other vaccines out there that do the same thing. I just know that this is one that does. And so for me, this was significant and not really expected. We did not expect to see the difference in the hybrid vaccine outperforming our modified live vaccine from a CMI response standpoint, number of cells. With BVD2, we see kind of the same thing. We got our kills. We have higher interferon levels and stuff of the CD4, CD8s in that hybrid, straight killed. And then, oops, I did something wrong there. But when we challenged these animals with BVD2, we didn't see quite the same height, but we still see a response with the animals, the 2014s, which had the one modified live at branding. That's the key here. They had one modified live at branding. Those are the cattle that performed even our calves that were on a straight modified live program. So to me, that told me I had switched my ranches over to Cattle Master. This reinforced that was the correct decision, in my opinion. Okay. One of the other things that was something that we saw in this particular research that we did not anticipate is Emily, in her quest, she was looking at differences like in rumen microflora, and those are other papers, and I don't understand it. She's way beyond me. I don't get it. But there was a lot of ruminal things that she looked at. Was there a difference between the vaccine schemes and stuff? But this is a very important slide here to me. So what we found is that the cows that were on the Cattle Master cows produce 60% more IgG than modified live cows. Not terribly surprising. I just never thought about that. But if Cattle Master is stimulating a really good antibody response, which is what we're seeing, along with the CMI response, you would expect there to be more immunoglobulins for BVD in that colostrum, right? That just kind of makes sense. But we sure didn't expect it to be that high. So what this told me is that when I booster my cows with Cattle Master, they're making better colostrum than they do with my modified lives. So our annual booster, of course, in our world occurs at preg check. And I think this underlines to me, because I am an absolute believer that colostrum is the key to a healthy animal. And if they don't get adequate colostrum, it doesn't matter what you do. If they get good colostrum, they're going to be a bomb-proof calf. Everything that you do to them then works better. If they've got good colostrum, then the vaccines that you give at branding are better. The vaccines at weaning are better, because that better colostrum allows them to absorb many more immune type cells, even whole cells, whole antibodies. Their immune system, and we know that that innate response is enhanced all the way through the feeding period with some work that was done at the Meat Animal Research Center, that effect, that first 12 to 18 hours has an effect on them all the way till they're harvested. So the better we can do with colostrum, the better off we are. So this was my conclusions in this particular is that the titers for IBR and BVD were similar between cattle receiving the hybrid vaccine and the modified live vaccine. And they increased over time. They seemed to plateau. But one of the things that I'm looking at, because one of the questions I had is, should I vaccinate every year? Or do I need to give a modified live when they're 6 years old to bump them? Had no idea. But when we look at on an individual basis, when we look at their titers and their performance at that 6-month and 12-month interval, what I found is that every time they receive a vaccine, there is a pretty good spike in that immune response. It tails off over time. But what happens is from the time they're born, and we started measuring this, all the way throughout to they're 6, 7, 8 years old, there's always a little step. So to me, it says annual vaccinations are really important, and you should be vaccinating your cows every year. So IBR and BVD titers were increased in cattle receiving the hybrid. So we didn't see a lot of difference between the IBR with our modified lives and our hybrid. Not terribly surprising now, because the IBR is a modified live, quote unquote. It's chemically altered. But when it comes to the BVD, we do see more of a difference, especially with the hybrid. So both modified lives and hybrid vaccines can be used without disrupting heifer and cow reproduction. So we do have cows out there to ranch, that's the modified live, that's all they've ever gotten in their life. No effect on reproduction, right? So depending on how you prepare those cattle, but for me, the take-home message of this is prepare those calves, and you start preparing your replacement heifers by vaccinating their mother. Does that make sense? It's the colostrum that those calves get that is going to help set them up. Then you start at branding. And I think, my opinion, this is just my opinion, that the modified live should be used at branding. And that's what I do in all my outfits. We use a modified live at branding, and then go into the weaning period, and we booster those modified lives. And then if I'm going to go pre-breeding, in places where we do pre-breeding vaccines, I want to try to do it 60 days before we're breeding on them. Give them the last booster at that 60-day time period. Then after that, they're a cow. Once they're a cow, we vaccinate them at preg check. And I think now it's worth the effort to make sure that you vaccinate those cattle when they're coming through the chute at preg check time. Okay? So for me, and I want to point out Emily, she's now, this was part of her PhD project. She didn't know she was going to do this when she started there for PhD. I just heaped everything on her. And she was amazing, because she got all of her PhD work done and all this done. She spent 2.5 months at Auburn running blood work that had accumulated since 2014. And so we sent her to Auburn in the spring, late spring. So she cooked her goose. If y'all have been to Auburn, how hot it is. There's other folks, Eric Schulger's, he's one of the folks at NMSU. He's guided this research all along. Zoetis, and the reason I have Zoetis on there is because I had all this blood accumulated, and finally Zoetis gave Emily a grant so we could get it paid for and get all this blood stuff run. We're just now, she's working on the publications now, so this will be published coming up. But I grabbed these slides from her because I think this is important. And especially from my standpoint as a cow-calf veterinarian, I think it's important that you understand that you need to start with the dams of the replacement heifers you're going to keep. and then really get to work on those replacement heifers. I use a lot of modified lives in that period, but afterwards I'm sold now on the hybrid. And I can tell you, I used others. And there was some work. Dr. Gill asked me a question about, what about other kills? So what Dr. Perry talked about, this work that was done at Auburn, they prepped those cattle, and the way that they exposed them is they turned them out in what they called a pasture. It was 8 acres. I mean, gosh, that's a corral, right? In our world, doesn't count as a pasture. It was 8 acres, and they turned them out there with both a type 1 and a type 2 PI calf. So there was daily exposure. They turned them out with a latently infected red nose animal, and then brought them in at 100 days and gave them a dose of IBR in the vein. I mean, that's a pretty stout challenge. 100% of the controls lost their pregnancies. And so what they found is that statistically there wasn't any difference between the modified live and the cattle master in that program. But they did the same thing with a different set of cows. They came up and then they did cattle master, triangle, and ViraShield. That's been published. I guess I can say the names. And they compared those. They repeated the same thing. They vaccinated them, they AI'd them, they turned them out with the PIs, they did all that stuff. 50% of the cattle master cattle lost their pregnancy. And if you noticed in the first study, like what Dr. Perry was saying, there was very few. But 50% of the cattle master, 75% of the triangle cows lost their pregnancy, and 98% or 95%, these numbers may not be exact, but I think it was 95% of the ViraShield cattle lost their pregnancy, and the ViraShield cattle was the same as the controls. But that was because they were challenged. I was a ViraShield fan, and I'm not knocking the vaccine, I'm just telling you my experience. I was a ViraShield guy, but I think we were getting by because they weren't challenged. Because when those cattle were challenged, they couldn't hold up to the challenge. So I asked them specifically, why did the cattle master cattle lose half of their pregnancies, or half of them lose it? And the reason was they were not prepped with a modified live first. So that's the difference. That modified live primer is an absolute key, and if you're not using one, you need to. Get with your veterinarian and use one. So, can I answer any questions, or do you want me to just go on to the antibiotic stuff, Ron? And then take questions at the end. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yes. No. So the question was, is on the, with those heifers specifically is what I was talking about. I do a pre-breeding in some places, not all of them. I do a pre-breeding vaccination at 60 days before breeding on heifers. Once they become a cow and they're in the cow herd, the only vaccination they'll ever see is at preg check. No. So the question was, is on these big outfits, big country outfits like what I deal with, do you feel guilty about not doing it pre-breeding, no, I have never felt guilty about it. And the reason why is that colostrum stuff. Even before I knew this, the biggest problem that we have in our big pasture outfits is we lose pregnancies from from basically middle of December to middle of February. That's when we lose our pregnancies. And so I want my immunity at the highest level when that's, because a lot of those pregnancy losses we understand are stress related, they're energy compromised, the weather's bad, it's cold, and if there's a disease present, it's probably going to be more active during that period of time. So I've always wanted to vaccinate my cows at preg check, because I figure that's the closest I'm going to bump that immunity up to when our problems are the greatest. So no, I've always felt like preg checking is the way I want to do it. Yeah, Houston. So the question is about Vibrio. So Vibrio I still use, and part of it is because it always seems to, it's really hard to diagnose. But it seems like when we don't vaccinate, it nips at us. But I know for sure, especially after doing all this blood work that we found, lepto vaccine isn't great, but it's all we got. And so you only get about 5 months immunity out of lepto vaccine. And in our part of the world, there's a couple of different types of leptos, like there are different serovars. The lepto that we see in our part of the world is a late-term abortion. There's other leptos that you see that are early embryonic deaths. But in our world, it's the abortion side of things. So by vaccinating in the fall with our Vibrio lepto, we're hoping that we don't lose as many of those big pregnancies that will go on. And do I think it's worthwhile to do annually? Yes. There are some vaccines. There's one vaccine in particular that is labeled for 12 months protection against one serovar, and it's the Cadillac vaccine. It's pretty good. But for the most part, my vaccination protocol is to give your viral vaccine and a Vibrio lepto when you preg check in the fall. And I don't use the combinations. I give separate shots for those two. And the reason I do that is because I've been interested in vaccine for a long time. And so I've toured a lot of vaccine companies, I've toured their plants, and I've also talked to a lot of tech services folks. And over the years, I've always asked them, what about these big combination ones? The thing of it is when you mix a viral component with a bacterial component, which is what Vibrio lepto are, BVD is the antigen that suffers the most. And they'll tell you that. BVD is the one that they struggle to get the efficacy of that particular antigen in those big combinations. Well, if BVD is the most concerning disease I got, I don't want to take a chance. I don't want to compromise. So I separate my Vibrio lepto and give a separate shot. And I've talked to folks because I thought, well, maybe technology has changed. But when I talk to tech services guys and they say, oh, you got your guys separating them, I wouldn't change that. So I still feel pretty comfortable. I think it's better to do the two different shots because the antigens, the adjuvants that I give, they're different in bacterial components than they are the viruses. So I don't want to mix them. Give them hands width apart, follow your BQA stuff. Yes, sir. Okay, 2 questions. Yes. So the question is if you get forced into buying some unknown cattle where you don't have any information about them, how would you vaccinate them? And in my opinion, yes, I would give them 2 doses, 30 days apart of the Cattle Master. Because I know from a viral response, I'm getting a pretty good viral protection with that, but you've got the safety. Because if there's some early breds in there that you didn't know about or whatever, however, how put together cattle are, you never know for sure. If there's some breds in there, you won't affect that pregnancy. So it's safe, but I think it's a great compromise. Now, if I'm buying replacement heifers that I don't know anything about, I want to get at least 1 modified live into them. And I'd really prefer 2, 30 days apart, if I can manage that. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the question is that do you worry about in a branding situation where you might have already turned the bulls out and you may have some early pregnancies, especially in that day 40 where there could be some PIs and stuff like that? Is that a concern for using a modified live? To cover my tail, I got to say, ask your veterinarian. But this is what I do. This is what I do. This is just my opinion. If I use BovaShield, I don't even think about it. I've used BovaShield since 1988. And never once have I seen a problem associated with it. And I started doing it on suckling calves, turning them, that the bulls were turned out 60 days prior to when they brand. giving them to that suckling calves in cows that were naive. And no change in branding percents, no change in weaning percents, none of that stuff ever occurred for me. So, and that was based on some work that Kansas State did, where they, in one study that Kansas State did, I'll qualify this, it was just one study, where they looked at viral shedding depending on vaccine brands. And Bovishield, they never documented viral shedding. So for me, that was why I picked Bovishield. And I guess, as it turns out, I think I made a good choice. I'm very comfortable using Bovishield, and I understand there's all kinds of arguments. If Zoetis was in here, they'd be pulling their hair out at what I'm saying, because it's absolutely against the label to do that. But in my hands, that's what I do. I have no qualms about vaccinating a calf with Bovishield. It's because I work for a university, it's hard for me to recommend. But that's what I tell my ranches. I tell my ranchers, use Bovishield. And there may be other modified lives that work exactly the same and are every bit as good. It's just that I don't have the familiarity with them. I am extremely comfortable with Bovishield. Yes? So the question was, is in our data, do we have the ability to tie individual animals, their CMI response and their antibody response? Yes, we have that capability. That's probably going to be one of the papers that come out. Because to me that was interesting. That's why I bled each animal all the time. I wanted to know on an individual basis, like how much do they go up? And how long do they stay? You know, that to me, that's stuff that I was interested in. So the comment was the relationship between the CMI response and the antibody response. And I got an idea that what we're going to find is that some individuals are just better. And some individuals are not very good. Because that's what we see in people, right? We see in people that there's people that never get sick and people that are sick all the time. I expect the same thing in these calves. In this, what we see in this data set, once we get to that number, I would expect to see some differences. And I think they're going to be paired like you're talking about. I think if they're pretty good with a CMI response, I think they're going to be pretty good with an antibody response, would be my guess. Yeah. So the question is why did we see kind of an unexpected response with the hybrid vaccine? Different than what we kind of thought. We see a higher cell-mediated response than we would expect. And in talking with the folks at Zoetis who have helped us with this project, Dan Scruggs, Paul Walls at Auburn, Emily Sholey Falkenberg, who's now at Auburn, and their impression is the only answer they've got is the adjuvant system that's used in that vaccine. That the way that it presents it to the immune system may be a little bit different. And maybe that's why we're seeing a little bit of an enhanced response that we wouldn't have expected. Obviously, I think what this does is tells us we need to look further. There's a lot more research that needs to be done associated with this because, for one thing, this is too small to draw large conclusions on. But it backs up what I've been saying, so I really like it, okay? That's the biggest reason. This backs up what I've been saying for a while. It collaborates what my thoughts were, so this is all I want to know right there. That's as far as I want to take it. I don't want to find anything else to tell me that I've been wrong. Any other questions? Okay. I've been asked to touch on one more thing. This. Antimicrobial resistance and antibiotic use in cattle. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to kind of fly through some of this, but I want to just set a little groundwork. Because y'all, as y'all are aware, June of this year, life is going to be different. Because at the end of June this year, there will no longer be antimicrobials that are over the counter. You'll have to get them via prescription. So you will no longer be able to go to the feed store and buy LA200 or penicillin or whatever. You can still buy it from the feed store, but it will require a prescription. And this is why, if you look at the bottom there, it's Guidance for Industry number 263 was one of the last guidances that came out because of antimicrobial resistance. I don't know if you all are familiar with that term or not, but there's been a phenomenon that was recognized or at least brought to the forefront, you know, in that 2014, 2015 time frame. There's a lot of testimony on Capitol Hill because they were blaming the livestock industry for antimicrobial resistance in human medicine. And so there was a lot of factors that went into this. So this is a real thing. Antimicrobial resistance is real. And the reason that's important is because I have grandkids. Now my kids not so much, but my grandkids, I want antibiotics to work for them. And so what that means is as an industry, we have to be more judicious. We can't make Bloody Marys anymore. We can't be throwing this and that together. We can't be treating just because we want to treat them. We better have a treatment plan and guidance as to how we're going to use these antimicrobials. Because there's a pharmacologist by the name of Mike Apley who spent months in Washington, D.C., testifying before Congress and fought his tail off to preserve the uses that we have now. We used to be able to use antimicrobials for 5 things: treatment, control, prevention, growth promotion, and feed efficiency. When the hearings were done, they took away feed efficiency and growth promotion. That's why the VFD came into play. You can no longer use antimicrobials for growth or feed efficiency. Can only be used for treatment, control, and prevention. And based upon testimony of Dr. Apley and others, they did get treatment or prevention and control maintained. But that's on the chopping block for those people. They're beginning to say, or they did say at that time, no, we think you should only be able to treat sick ones. That's it. It's the only time you can use it. Luckily, they were able to salvage and keep prevention and control on the block for us. But I can tell you we're under a microscope now. So what they're looking for is misuse of antimicrobials that they can use to beat us over the head with to take prevention and control. So this really is important. So just a couple of definitions. Tell me if I get too long. Bruce, make sure I don't go too long. Prescription drugs we all are aware about requires a prescription from your veterinarian. Over the counter, those are the products that you just go in the feed store and you could buy them. No big deal. Antibiotic. There's difference. It's an antibiotic and an antimicrobial are not necessarily the same thing. An antibiotic is a naturally occurring compound, which means it happens in nature, which means that's why there's resistance present, for one thing, is because it happens in nature. So nature and the bugs that are in nature fight the things that hurt them. But an antimicrobial is a synthetic. And so what happened is the World Health Organization and CDC, they got together and they formulated a list of what medications are important to human medicine. And all of this is based on this right here, the veterinary client-patient relationship. If you don't have a veterinarian that you work with, you better get one. Because as of June, you won't be able to buy LA200 or Thailand or anything else without a veterinary prescription. So for the rules for veterinarians are, which has been in place for a long time, but nobody paid attention to it. I cannot sell you an antibiotic for your animal unless I either see the animal individually or I have been on your place and am familiar with the care and keeping of your animals. That part right there. I have sufficient knowledge of the animals by the veterinarian to initiate at least a general preliminary diagnosis. I've seen and is personally acquainted with the keeping and care of the animals. Means I have to be on your place at least once a year in New Mexico to be able to maintain a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. If this doesn't exist, you can't sell your drugs. So is it because veterinarians are being jerks? The answer is no. If they don't know your particular circumstance, care and keeping, they have to see the animal. Because what's at stake for us is if we get caught with this, we lose our license. That's what's at stake. So this has got to change. Using a drug, labeled drug use means you do it exactly as the label says. There's no variance of any kind. That means dose, route, species, indication. Doesn't matter. It has to be exactly as the label says. That's the only way you can use these drugs. You can use a drug extra label. That means there's some kind of a variance. And maybe those of you that raise or have show lambs or goats or anything like that, you realize there's very few medications that are labeled for them. So most everything you do is extra label. That has to be by prescription. You cannot go to the feed store, buy an antibiotic, and use it in your own animal and use it extra label. That is prohibited by law. And so in June, this is going to become more exaggerated. So remember, your veterinarian has to issue a prescription to use a drug extra label. So there's other guidances and all this, but this is it. Based on medically important antimicrobial drugs in food-producing animals should be limited to those that are considered necessary for assuring animal health. And so remember, it wasn't us that deemed which of these are medically important. So just to give you some idea, the biggest point is to read the label. Make sure you're acquainted with the label. I just picked Draxxin here as an example. I'm not going to spend time on it. But there's a lot of information on those labels that you need to be aware of now, because now the onus is on you. You better understand what you're doing. So what they did is they put out these guidances. There are drugs that are deemed critically important, highly important, or important. And there's criteria how they meet them, and I'm not going to go into that either. But to give you some idea, what are the critically important drugs such as fluoroquinolones like Baytril? Do y'all realize that if you use Baytril extra label, that is the #1 residue that they want to catch somebody with? Baytril is bad news if you ever get caught. They will hang you. I can tell you that. They are looking for somebody to violate the law with Baytril. So be really cautious how you use it. Make sure, because you can't use it extra label. A veterinarian can't prescribe it extra label. So be really cautious with that. We got our macrolides such as Draxxin and all these. The thing that you need to understand and why veterinary oversight is important is I have people that say, that Draxxin, it doesn't work very good. I need Zactrin or Zuprevo. They're the same thing. The action is the same. The killing mechanism is the same. So when you change from Draxxin to Zuprevo, you're not changing anything. You need to be aware of that. You need to change mechanisms. If some antibiotic isn't performing the way it needs to be, you haven't picked the right one. And you need to change classes or the killing action of them. The macrolides, the third generation cephalosporins, Naxel, Exceed, all those, these are all critically important, which means that that's what they're keeping their eye on the most. The highly important are the penicillins, the aminopenicillins, the aminoglycosides, tetracyclines. Now, tetracyclines have been around since what? The 40s, I think. For crying out loud. You really think that us putting it in a sick calf is causing resistance? But in the eyes of Congress, they didn't care. So, and then we have important ones. And so I'm going to skip some of this stuff. There are different actions. You got to remember what their action class is, the fluoroquinolones, because how they kill makes a difference. So like with our fluoroquinolones, the way you cannot use them extra label. I can't use them extra label. You need to be aware of that. Where are you going to use those drugs at? Other critically important ones, the macrolides, Tylan, Zuprevo, we just talked about that. They're labeled for respiratory disease caused by Mannheimia, Pasteurella, Histophilus, and Mycoplasma. That's it. Now some of them, like I think it's Draxxin, is labeled for pink eye and foot rot caused by a particular. So if you're using it for anything else, that's against the law. So if you want to use, oh, I got some Draxin and this calf is scoured, I'm just going to give him a shot of Draxin because he's got scours. I want to give him something. So you give him a shot of Draxin. That's illegal because it's not a labeled indication. Okay? Other critically important. So if you notice that most of these critically important ones, extra labeled drug use is prohibited. That means you have to use it exactly as the label states. We can use a few, like some of our sulfas can be used as long as there's a valid VCPR in place. Highly important, I'm not going to go through those. Our LA200s, I mean, they're still good drugs. It's just that now they will be prescription. The VFD, I'm sure you're familiar with. The veterinary feed directive means that you have to have a prescription from a veterinarian to feed an antibiotic to a class of cattle. Now, as a veterinarian, I can prescribe for you to feed a sick animal. That's not a problem. You don't need an VFD for that. I could tell you, okay, take this powder and give it for a week or whatever. But if you're going to wean a set of calves and you want to put them on chlorotetracycline for a week or 10 days or whatever you're going to do and put it on there, you have to have a VFD to do that. Prescription. Okay. Here's our summary. If we don't show judicious and accountable use of antimicrobials now, then the antimicrobials labeled for prevention and control may go away. And we do not want that. So that means we have to be very careful and pay more attention to how we use antimicrobials. It's really important because we have to, because we are under the microscope, we got to make sure that everything we do falls under the guise of judicious use, which means you better know what you're treating and how. And we don't use this particular antibiotic because it expired 2 years ago, so I need to use it up because I've spent the money on it. I don't want to just throw it away. We can't do that anymore. We got to be really careful how we do this stuff. I think that's it. That's good enough. Any questions that I can answer on that? I think it's just important to understand where we are with that particular thought process with antimicrobials. Be careful. What's the number one residue in beef cattle? Any idea? Number one residue. Well, it changed. It was penicillin. Why would it be penicillin? Because you could go get it anywhere, right? That's why it was number one. Number two now is number one now is Banamine. And you got just an example of all these changes. You know, Banamine, we use quite a bit, especially treating respiratory calves, right? There is a labeled topical, a pour-on that's Banamine, which means, so now you can't use the injectable because there is a labeled alternative. So you can't inject Banamine to a sick calf unless you do it IV. If you're giving it in the muscle, you're breaking the law because you cannot use Banamine injectable extra label because there's a labeled alternative. Okay? That's how strict things have gotten. So be aware and be careful. Okay? Bruce, done.
Thanks, John.